On the 14th day of the war, the tension in Washington was impossible to ignore. During a press briefing, a reporter asked Donald Trump a simple but loaded question: "When will this war be over?" Trump paused for a moment, thinking carefully before answering. Then he said something that left the room unusually quiet. "When I feel it? When I feel it in my bones." He made it clear that the war wouldn't end when Iran surrendered. It wouldn't end when the vital shipping route known as the Strait of Hormuz reopened. And it wouldn't necessarily end with a ceasefire agreement or a diplomatic framework. According to him, the war would end when the President of the United States felt it was over. For the global energy market, already shaken by the conflict, that statement sounded less like a timeline and more like uncertainty. And on the very same day, events on the ground took a dramatic turn. The Pentagon announced it was deploying 2,200 U.S. Marines to the Middle East. They would be traveling aboard a massive amphibious assault ship, the USS Tripoli, LHA-7. The vessel, based in Japan, had already begun sailing toward the Persian Gulf. But this wasn't a routine deployment. On board was an entire Marine Expeditionary Unit, a rapid response combat force equipped for frontline combat operations. The ship carried helicopter gunships, armed infantry, special operations teams, armored vehicles, transport aircraft, and landing craft specifically designed to put troops onto a hostile shoreline. The deployment had been requested by United States Central Command and personally approved by Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. Officially, the mission was straightforward: help reopen the Strait of Hormuz. But behind the official explanation, military analysts saw something much bigger. This was the moment the conflict began to change. Until now, the war had been fought mostly from the air, American and Israeli jets, drones, and long-range missiles, striking Iranian targets from high altitude and from a distance. But by day 14, the nature of the war was shifting. Because the Marines boarding the USS Tripoli weren't bomber crews, they were infantry. They were the kind of troops you send when something must be taken physically, held physically, or fought over at close range, often near coastlines and strategic waterways. Their arrival in the Gulf would dramatically change the battlefield. And it would also expose them to a threat environment unlike anything American Marines had faced in years. The last time the United States deployed large ground forces into the Middle East, the conflict lasted 2 decades. On Friday morning, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth addressed the press. Standing at the podium, he declared that the United States was on plan to defeat and disable Iran's military capabilities at a pace the world had never seen before. He also revealed that since February 28th, U.S. and Israeli forces had struck more than 15,000 Iranian targets, production facilities, military infrastructure, strategic installations. But behind the confident statements and the rising numbers, one question still lingered. Was this war nearing its end? Or was it only entering its most dangerous phase? At the same briefing, Pete Hegseth continued describing what he called the collapse of Iran's military system. He claimed that Iran's military plants, weapons production lines, and defense innovation centers had already been defeated. According to him, Iran's leadership was now desperate, hiding underground, afraid to show itself. Then he used a word that instantly grabbed attention. He said, "That's what rats do." But moments later, the tone of the entire war briefing changed. Hegseth made a far more dramatic claim. He said the newly appointed supreme leader of Iran, Mojtaba Khamenei, was wounded and likely disfigured. It was a shocking statement, yet no evidence followed. No photographs, no medical report, no intelligence document made public. Instead, Hegseth pointed to something else: the absence of video. He argued that Iran has cameras, television networks, and recording equipment ready at all times. If the supreme leader was capable of appearing publicly, then why was his latest statement read by a news anchor instead of delivered by him directly? To Hegseth, that silence meant something. His father was dead. He was injured. He was hiding. "He's scared," Hegseth told reporters. "He's on the run, and he lacks legitimacy." Then he added, "It's a mess for them. Who's in charge? Iran may not even know." But less than 1 hour later, a very different picture emerged. In Tehran, thousands of people gathered for Quds Day, the yearly event that fills the streets of the Iranian capital. And standing in front of cameras, visible to photographers in the crowd, were 2 of Iran's most powerful officials, Masoud Pezeshkian, Ali Larijani. The same Larijani who, just 10 days earlier, had warned that Iran could turn off the lights across the entire Middle East within 30 minutes if the United States attacked Iran's power grid. Both men were there. Both men were standing in public. Neither of them was underground. Neither of them was hiding. And neither of them looked like the rats described in Washington. In fact, those supposed rats had just organized a mass public rally. And that moment revealed something important about day 14 of this war. More than missiles, more than naval deployments, more than oil prices. What truly defined this moment was an information gap. At a podium in Washington, the U.S. Secretary of Defense described Iran's leadership as broken, injured, and hiding. At the exact same time, Iran was broadcasting images of its leadership standing openly in front of thousands of supporters in Tehran. Two completely different realities, two completely different narratives, and the world was left trying to decide which version of the war was real. On one side of the story stood the podium in Washington. On the other side were the streets of Tehran. At that very moment, Iran, the country described as collapsing under relentless strikes, was holding a mass rally in broad daylight, attended by its president and one of its top national security officials. Somewhere between those two realities lay the true state of the war on day 14th. And into that uncertainty, the United States was now sending 2,200 Marines. To understand why this deployment matters, you have to understand the battlefield they're sailing toward, the Strait of Hormuz. At its narrowest point, the strait is only 33 kilometers wide. On one side lies Iran, with a coastline stretching hundreds of kilometers along the eastern edge of the Persian Gulf. And along that coastline, Iran has spent decades building one of the most heavily fortified coastal defense networks in the world. Missile systems are hidden in hardened installations. Mobile launchers can relocate within minutes. Underground bunkers store weapons and equipment. Concealed batteries sit positioned specifically to target ships attempting to pass through the waterway. These are not improvised defenses. Iran's anti-ship missile systems have ranges measured in hundreds of kilometers, meaning a launcher positioned far inland can still strike a vessel moving through the middle of the strait. Since February 28th, according to Pete Hegseth, American and Israeli forces have already struck more than 15,000 targets across Iran. But there is a problem that no press conference can easily solve. Iran's coastal missile network was designed to survive sustained air attacks. The launchers are mobile, missiles are stored underground, crews disperse and relocate constantly. Destroying one launcher might take a single airstrike, but destroying every launcher, every mobile system, every underground storage site, and every trained crew capable of operating them is an entirely different challenge. And that challenge is the condition military planners have emphasized to United States Central Command before any Marine unit moves anywhere near the strait. Meanwhile, the economic pressure is growing. This week, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent suggested that U.S. Navy escorts for commercial ships moving through the Strait of Hormuz could begin soon. But he also made one thing clear. Before any escort mission begins, the military intends to target the land-based anti-ship missile systems Iran has positioned along the coastline. The sequence makes sense. First, neutralize the missile threat, then move ships through the strait. But there's another complication. Iran has now had 2 full weeks to observe American targeting patterns and adjust accordingly. Every launcher that once sat in a fixed location may now be somewhere else, hidden, relocated, waiting. And that means that when American ships and Marines move closer to the Strait of Hormuz, they may be entering a battlefield that is far less predictable than it appears from the air. By now, the intelligence picture that existed before February 28th had already begun to fade. For years, U.S. intelligence had built a detailed understanding of Iran's military infrastructure, using satellites, intercepted communications, and human sources on the ground. But once the war began, many of those carefully tracked assets started moving. Missile launchers relocated, equipment disappeared from known sites, units dispersed across the coastline. In other words, the intelligence map that once guided American planning was now partially outdated, which means the Marines aboard the USS Tripoli, LHA-7, are not sailing into a battlefield that has already been cleared. They are being sent to create that clearance themselves. The possible mission is the kind of operation Marine units were specifically built for: seizing or neutralizing Iranian-controlled islands near the Strait of Hormuz, establishing positions that could shield commercial ships from missile attacks, or securing strategic locations along the narrow corridor that carries a major share of the world's energy supply. A Marine Expeditionary Unit, the type of force aboard the Tripoli, is designed for exactly this scenario. It can launch helicopter assaults, land amphibious forces on hostile shores, and establish defensive perimeters inside contested territory faster than almost any other U.S. military formation. But that capability comes with a reality military planners understand very well. In exactly these kinds of environments, a Marine Expeditionary Unit can also suffer casualties faster than almost any other American unit. Meanwhile, Iranian leaders have responded to the growing pressure with defiance. Senior military officials in Tehran have dismissed talk of a ceasefire. They claim Iran possesses unlimited missiles. They claim they have America by the throat. And they insist they have no intention of letting go. Whether that statement reflects reality or simply wartime rhetoric, it describes the atmosphere the Marines are sailing toward. One of the clearest signals came from Ali Larijani, who appeared publicly in Tehran on the same day U.S. officials were accusing Iran's leadership of hiding underground. Larijani made the broader stakes unmistakably clear. But the most revealing numbers may not come from military briefings at all. They come from global shipping data. According to maritime analytics firm Lloyd's List Intelligence, only 77 ships passed through the Strait of Hormuz during March 2026. During the same period 1 year earlier, 229 ships made that passage. That represents a collapse of roughly 94%. More than 1,000 cargo vessels are now anchored outside the strait, waiting. Insurance markets have effectively withdrawn coverage. Shipping companies are refusing to send their crews through those waters at almost any price the global economy can currently sustain. And as the crisis deepens, even America's allies are beginning to adjust. Countries like Germany, France, and Italy are no longer waiting for U.S. naval escorts. Instead, they are speaking directly with Iran, seeking permission for their ships to pass through the strait. Because at this moment, the world's most critical energy corridor is no longer just a shipping route. It has become the center of a geopolitical standoff, one that could reshape global trade, military strategy, and the balance of power in the Middle East. As the crisis deepened, another development revealed how far the situation had shifted. Reports emerged that India had negotiated directly with Iranian officials, securing permission for 2 LPG tankers to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. It was a quiet arrangement, part of a bilateral discussion with Tehran, but the implications were enormous. Countries that were formerly aligned with the United States were now quietly negotiating with the same country the United States was bombing every day. This is what Iran's strategy looks like when it works. Not necessarily a military victory, but a political fragmentation of the coalition opposing it. Or, in this case, the slow realization that the coalition the United States expected to hold together may never have fully existed. Inside Washington, even military planners had begun to acknowledge a critical oversight. Officials at United States Central Command admitted to Congress that their planning had not fully accounted for a scenario in which Iran would actually close the strait. It had been considered a possibility, but not the central plan. The original expectation was very different. The campaign would be short. Mojtaba Khamenei would lose legitimacy. Internal pressure inside Iran would grow, and the war would end quickly. At one point, Donald Trump predicted it might take 4 days, maybe a week, but now it was day 14, when 2,200 Marines were sailing toward the narrowest point of the world's most important energy corridor. The moment Trump described, when he would feel it in his bones that the war was ending, had clearly not arrived yet, because the deployment of a Marine Expeditionary Unit tells its own story, not in the language of press conferences, but in the logic of military operations. You do not send a Marine Expeditionary Unit into a theater where the air campaign has already achieved its objectives. You send one when the air campaign has not achieved a critical objective. And that objective now requires a different kind of force. In this case, the objective is clear: reopen the Strait of Hormuz. 2 weeks of the most intense American bombing campaign since World War II have not reopened it. The drone boats are still there. The naval mines are still there. The coastal missile systems are still there, or they have moved but not been destroyed. And the 94% collapse in shipping traffic is still unfolding, which means the Marines are coming. This escalation has its own logic, and that logic is economic as much as military. The global economy simply cannot absorb a 94% reduction in Gulf shipping for very long. Oil markets have already reacted violently. Prices have swung between $80 and $107 per barrel in just 2 weeks, rising or falling with every new statement from Washington, Tehran, or military commanders in the region. To calm the markets, the United States has turned to its emergency reserves. The United States Strategic Petroleum Reserve has already released 400 million barrels of oil in an attempt to stabilize prices. But that reserve is finite, and releasing oil from storage is only a temporary measure. It is not a solution, because the real solution lies in a single narrow waterway, the strait. And the strait will not reopen through statements delivered at a podium inside the Pentagon. On Friday, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth announced that the air campaign had just reached its most intense day yet as part of Operation Epic Fury. But intensity alone does not reopen a shipping lane. And that is why, as the war enters its 3rd week, the next phase may no longer be decided in the air. It may be decided in the narrow waters of the Strait of Hormuz. At the latest briefing, Pete Hegseth delivered one of the most sweeping claims of the entire conflict. He said Iran's air force was effectively gone. Its navy had been destroyed. Its missile stockpiles were being depleted. And its leadership, he insisted, was now hiding underground. Then the United States took an unusual step. Through the Rewards for Justice program, Washington announced a $10 million bounty for information leading to the location of Iran's newly named supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei. 9 other senior Iranian officials were added to the same list. Among them, Ali Larijani, Iran's intelligence minister, the interior minister, and senior commanders of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. In effect, the United States government was now offering money to anyone who could reveal the location of Iran's highest leadership. Yet there was a contradiction at the center of that decision. The same government issuing the reward could not confirm whether the supreme leader was alive, wounded, or even able to function. Behind the scenes, the uncertainty was becoming even more obvious. During a private call with leaders of the G7, Donald Trump reportedly said that Mojtaba was not in good shape. And then he added something even more revealing. No one, he said, actually knows who's in charge, which creates a strange and dangerous situation. If no one is clearly leading Iran, then no one may be able to end the war, even if they wanted to. There is no clear authority to negotiate with, no phone number to call, no official capable of announcing a surrender. Masoud Pezeshkian holds the presidency, but real military power inside Iran rests elsewhere. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps answers to the supreme leader, or to whoever may currently be making decisions in his place. And the IRGC itself has powerful institutional reasons to continue the fight. Meanwhile, diplomatic channels are still quietly operating. Steve Witkoff, acting as Washington's envoy to the region, reportedly sent a message to Tehran through Oman. But the response came not through a negotiation table. It came in public. At the Quds Day rally in Tehran, visible to both the crowd and the cameras, Ali Larijani rejected the latest American overture. The message was unmistakable. The strait would remain closed, the war would continue, and the only acceptable outcome for Iran was an American withdrawal from the region. And yet, despite the uncertainty, despite the lack of a clear negotiating partner, the Marines are still sailing, because from a military perspective, the logic is simple. The air campaign has been running for 2 weeks. The strait is still closed, the war has not ended, and the moment when the president said he would feel it in his bones has not arrived yet. So the next step unfolds. But the comparison that many analysts are now making deserves careful attention. This conflict is not like the war in Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, the United States spent 21 years fighting insurgents in mountainous terrain, many armed primarily with small arms and improvised explosives. Iran is something very different. It possesses ballistic missiles, drone boats, naval mines, and advanced coastal defenses, weapons specifically designed to challenge naval forces operating in the Persian Gulf. And that means the next phase of this war may unfold in a battlefield far more complex and far more dangerous. This war is unfolding in an environment far more complex than many early predictions suggested. Iran is not an isolated battlefield. It has naval mines, coastal anti-ship missile batteries, and drone forces positioned along the Persian Gulf. It has a network of allied groups stretching across the region, from Iraq to Lebanon to Yemen. Its newly named supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, remains an uncertain figure whose location and condition are still unclear to American intelligence. And perhaps, most importantly, according to assessments attributed to the Central Intelligence Agency, the Iranian population has not risen up against its government. There are no signs of a domestic uprising, which means the internal collapse that some planners expected has not happened. But Iran also has something Afghanistan never had: oil, and with it, control over the world's most important energy choke point, the Strait of Hormuz. That control gives Tehran leverage not just over the United States, but over every economy on Earth that depends on fuel moving through the Gulf. So the war continues. The Marines will arrive. The bombing campaign will intensify. And Donald Trump will keep waiting for the moment he says will tell him when the war is over, the moment he feels it in his bones. That moment may take a long time. Because in Tehran, during the Quds Day rally, 2 senior officials, Masoud Pezeshkian and Ali Larijani, stood in front of tens of thousands of people while U.S. officials in Washington described Iranian leaders as hiding underground. The crowd was chanting. Cameras were rolling. There were no bunkers, no signs of hiding. Instead, there was a very public message directed at Washington. We are still here. We are still standing. And across the ocean, the response was already underway. 2,200 Marines were sailing toward the Strait of Hormuz. The conflict had already taken lives. 13 Americans were reported dead. One side says the war will end when the president feels it. The other says the war will continue until every American base in the Middle East is closed and every soldier has gone home. 2 visions of how this war ends, one based on instinct, the other based on strategy.